Hi everybody, welcome back to English 90. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 6th of October, where I wanted to talk about the next chapter in our textbook, The Fourth Step in Writing. I also wanted to talk about paper number 1 and also remind you that your second journal is due at the ending of today. If you are watching this video today, Wednesday the 6th, it's due at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And it's very similar to what you did with your first journal. So I'm going to ask you to read an article. This article is about sleep and disease risk, and the connection between sleep and disease, or lack of sleep and disease. And you can see that this is from Harvard. So I'm asking you to read that article and then to summarize it, indicating the main points and the supporting details, and also give your response. Again, it will be dependent on the length of the original article, but most students end up writing something like a page or so in terms of summary and response, but as long as you think it needs to be. And then please send that to my email, and I will respond back and send that back to you on a graded checkmark scale. I'll go through it for grammar and mechanics as well as content, much like I did for the first journal. And ultimately, while we may not necessarily have gotten to everything with grammar and mechanics, you'll see that as the semester progresses, there will be more and more elements that we will be addressing that probably will make more sense to you after you review your journals in context of those particular classes. Though certainly at this time, if I were to make a comment on your journal about something for grammar and mechanics and you don't understand and you need clarification, you can ask me, or of course you can always look it up in the textbook, because eventually we will be getting to that. So you know that we began just very barely talking about grammar last class, and we'll continue to do so. The parts of speech and how those parts of speech are important in terms of understanding some of the more common grammatical errors that writers commit within sentences. And in fact, the fourth steps in writing, or the fourth step in writing, which I had assigned for today, talks about the idea of sentences. We've been mostly talking about paragraphs up until this point. And you'll see in the notes below that on page 113, it talks about, first, for instance, the idea of being parallel. That if you're listing things in a sentence, you want to make sure that the things that you're listing are balanced. And they give you an example. For instance, what you should say is something like, my job includes checking the inventory, initializing the orders, and calling the suppliers. This is on page 113. This is the first example. And notice that what we've got is a list in this sentence, and the verbs are all ing. Checking, initialing, and calling. That's considered parallel or balanced. It would be not parallel or not balanced if you were to say something like, my job includes checking the inventory, initialing the orders, and to call the suppliers. So in other words, we're not keeping that ing form. And you can see other examples of this as well. The game show contestant was told to be cheerful, charming, and with enthusiasm is not parallel. But saying that the game show contestant was told to be cheerful, charming, and enthusiastic is parallel, because we're using one word to describe how the game show contestant is supposed to act. So this is one element of sentences. It isn't necessarily the most important element of sentences, but since we are talking about the construction of sentences, you should try to be parallel in your constructions, and you should also be consistent. So the idea is that parallelism is also about consistency. We see that with verbs. Remember last class we were talking a little bit about verbs, those action words, and that the tense, the time period in which an action occurs, is based on the form of the verb that we use. This is on page 115, where basically what you want to do is to avoid something called tense hopping. Or in other words, once you begin in one tense, for instance, the past tense, and you're using, let's say, the ed form, then you maintain the past tense. Unless you have an irregular verb and it doesn't use the ed form. But once you start in the past, you stay in the past. If you're talking about the present, you stay in the present. If you're talking about the future, you stay in the future. Unless you're writing something about time travel, and it is possible for you to shift back and forth. But the reality is that you want to be consistent. The same as with pronouns. And I believe I mentioned pronouns last class, that pronouns take the place of a noun. A noun is a person, place, thing, or idea. So pronouns are words like he, she, it, they. And once you begin using a particular pronoun, you want to keep with that pronoun. So if you're talking about it, the school, then you want to continue calling it it. You don't want to shift into another kind of pronoun. For instance, like they, or he, or she. Now, I know pronouns have become very political at this point in time, so that there have been discussions as to whether or not he and she are the most accurate pronouns to talk about individuals, because we may not necessarily be that binary as a he or a she. And I understand that ultimately some of these political arguments are also are arguments that violate some of the grammatical rules. When in doubt, I just try to put things into plurals, because plurals, the they, tends to avoid some of the conflict that you might be experiencing with he or she. So that's my recommendation, is that, rather than talking about a person, you talk about people, so that you can talk about they or them when necessary. And then, of course, you should try to respect an individual's wishes if they express that they want to be referenced by a particular pronoun, that is their choice. But you also have your own choice about the pronoun that's used for you. But if you use plurals as pronouns, then you don't necessarily have to make decisions about he or she. And then if you want to think about the idea of language in sentences, you want to try to be as specific as possible. That's referenced on page 118, where ultimately the more specific you can be in a piece of writing, the more persuasive you're going to be in a piece of writing. So for instance, the example that they give you is that you could say something like the plane landed at the airport. That's perfectly fine. Or you could say the United Airlines 747 landed at Reagan National Airport. By using the specific names, it becomes a much more interesting sentence. Or you can say animals came through the place. Animals came through the place. Or you could say hungry lions padded silently through the savannah. So again, the more specific you can be, the more interesting your writing will be. And it's the same with verbs as well, to try to be specific and to try to use active verbs. There are examples of this on page 122, where ultimately you can say something like, when you're talking about a verb, you could say something like the car drove by, or you could say the car rumbled by, or how about the Mustang rumbled by? Again, the more specific you are, the better you are. Verbs also you should try to be active. What's known as an active verb is that it's very clear that the subject of the sentence, and the subject basically is responsible for engaging in the action, that the subject is actually engaging in a particular action rather than the action happening to them. So in other words, it would be active to say Lillian graded the journals. The grading is happening by Lillian, so Lillian is the subject of the sentence, and you can very clearly see that the subject is engaged in the action of grading. You could say the journals were graded by Lillian, but that's considered to be passive. It's almost as if the grading was happening to Lillian rather than Lillian engaging in the grading. Also, if you just do a word count, you'll see that it's longer when you say passive construction, such as the journals were graded by Lillian. It's a much shorter sentence when you say Lillian graded the journals. And they give you some examples of active verbs on page 122. You can say that the computer was turned on by Hakim, or much better construction, an active construction would be that Hakim turned on the computer. Again, we've got a shorter sentence as well. You can say the car's air conditioner was fixed by the mechanic. That's passive. Or a much better way of saying that would be the mechanic fixed the car's air conditioner. I don't know if these are necessarily errors per se. These are more tips or techniques to improve your writing. Just like trying to be concise on page 123, talking about how oftentimes we use expressions that can be stated in fewer words. And if something can be stated in fewer words, generally speaking, that's exactly what you want to do, because you want your writing to be clear and concise as much as possible. Length should come from argument, not from unnecessary language. So yes, you can say at this time, for instance, but you could also say now. Yes, you can say a large number of, but you can also say many. Yes, you can say due to the fact that, but you could also say because. So if you say something and you can rephrase it in fewer words, generally speaking, almost always you should try to do that, to try to avoid wordiness in your language and to be concise. And you also want to vary your sentences, and there's discussion of this starting on page 126. You don't want to have a lot of long sentences because that's considered to be very dense and difficult to read. You don't want to have a lot of short sentences because that's considered choppy and simplistic. So mixing up the length of the sentences, some long and some short, and also mixing up the sentence beginning so they don't all begin in the same way, especially if they are appearing next to one another. All of these are tips and techniques to improve writing. Though once we start talking about grammar, we'll start talking about errors. So there's a question of style. For instance, making sure that you can be concise in your writing. And then there's a question of grammar, something that's just an error or incorrect. I also had assigned in the 4 steps of writing a section about editing sentences. That's on pages 132 to 134. And this is where we begin to get references to some of the grammatical errors that we will be talking about over the course of the semester. For instance, you're supposed to write complete sentences. You're not supposed to write fragments. A fragment is an incomplete sentence. A sentence expresses a complete thought, so a fragment is an incomplete thought, as we will talk about next class. You're also supposed to avoid run-ons. This is when you are running on or joining 2 or more sentences with no dividing punctuation, dividing up the 2 sentences. Again, another mechanical error that we will discuss. Use the correct verb and pronoun forms. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. Using capitals correctly. And towards the ending of the semester, we'll start talking about some of the rules associated with capitals, though certainly you can look that up on your own if you wanted to. Using correct punctuation. Punctuation is basically just clues on how you would read a sentence. Think about the sentence sit down. It's a sentence that is very dependent on punctuation. If it ends with a period, sit down, it would be stated very differently than if it ended with a question mark, which would then sound something like sit down. And if it ended with an exclamation point, it would be sit down. Of course, you can hear the difference in my voice, but you can't hear that when you're reading, which is why we have things like punctuation, things like commas, semicolons, apostrophes, periods, question marks, exclamation points, colons, dashes, and parentheses. All of this will be coming up over the next several classes. We'll talk about each of these forms of punctuation and how to use them. You want to use correct modifiers. A modifier is a descriptive word, and you want to make sure that description is next to the word that is being described. You want to avoid slang and cliches, slang being informal language that usually is exclusionary. It's something like adolescents creating language, basically, so other people don't understand what they're saying, though sometimes slang can go mainstream and everybody uses it, but it's still considered to be informal and non-standard. So, rather than saying something like he's a cool dude, you can say that he's an interesting person. Even though you might understand what a cool dude means, again, it isn't considered to be standard. And if you were learning English as a second language, I think you would realize that it would be easier for you probably to understand he is an interesting person than to understand he's a cool dude, because you probably learned the standard language first and then the slang afterwards. Use correct spelling. This is where the computer is a godsend because of the spell check, and you should be using the spell check. It would be lazy not to use the spell check at this particular point in time. Though keep in mind that the spell check isn't necessarily always going to be correct. particularly if you have different words that have different meanings, but that ultimately could be spelled differently, but have a same sound, or perhaps it's a situation where you are using a word that is spelled correctly, but you are using it in an incorrect fashion in your sentence. So again, you can't rely on it completely, but you should be using your spell check. Um, and also the cut and paste function is incredibly important in your computer. This is one of the best ways you can improve your writing because you can make multiple drafts. We've been talking about drafting for a while, writing in stages and writing multiple kinds of assignments over a period of time and continually improving those drafts rather than trying to write the perfect first and last version of something, which is usually very difficult. And in terms of the formatting, your writing should be typed. And of course, if you're using a computer, will be typed. And it should be a standard font, a font that you would expect to find in a textbook, for instance. Times is a very common font. It's Times New Roman happens to be my favorite font. But anything that you would see in a textbook, you wouldn't want something like calligraphy or something that would be based on symbols, something that would appear odd. And the sizing is usually 11 to 12 point. That's what's considered to be standard. And you should have 1-inch margins on the sides of your writing so that there are places for comments from a reader, such as a teacher. And you should also have double spaced typing so that you are skipping every other line so that there are places for the teacher to write in comments. All of this is probably set automatically on your computer and the word processing program that you're using. Remember, we talked about word processing at the beginning of the semester. You might be using Microsoft Word, you might be using Google Docs, you might be using something else. All of them are pretty intuitive, and if it turns out that these things aren't set automatically, they should have rulers where you can set these things. And again, if you don't necessarily know how to do that, you can look it up fairly easily if you were to go online. And I had also included several videos at the beginning of the semester about word processing programs that you could watch to help familiarize yourself with that. So again, it's almost always just automatically set that way, but these are considered to be the standards of what would be expected when you submit in an assignment. Don't overuse the grammar check. There is a grammar check, but it's not nearly as sophisticated as it should be. That's not to say that it won't be eventually, but definitely you can rely on your spell check much more so than your grammar check. I always liken a grammar check to an intelligent friend who is quite capable of making a mistake, so that in the end, the grammar check is merely just a suggestion. And I know there are many of times where I realize the suggestion the grammar check is giving me is incorrect. In terms of editing, I always recommend that you print out a hard copy for yourself so that you're not just editing on the screen. You actually get to see something on paper. It makes it much easier to find errors. And if you are proofreading and you have difficulty concentrating, try reading backwards. Read from the last paragraph up to the first paragraph so you can really concentrate on the sentences themselves and any errors that might be within the sentences. I also recommend that you read out loud so that you can begin to hear errors. I've oftentimes likened this to listening to music. You may not know how to read music, but you can probably hear when a mistake is made. Let's say the wrong musical note is played. You may not be able to explain what that mistake is, but certainly you can hear it. And it's the same with grammar, that you may not necessarily be able to explain what the mistake is, but if you can hear the mistake and correct it, that's really all you need to do as a writer. Unless you are going to become a professional writer or you're going to become an English teacher, the whole point is to avoid errors. You don't necessarily have to be able to explain what these errors are. So all of this leads us to the idea that not only are we writing journals this semester, but I also wanted to do some formal writing assignments, papers as we call them, or essays. And I wanted to begin slowly and work our way up to the ending of the semester where we're actually writing something that looks like an expected college paper. But I wanted to begin with the paragraph because we've been talking about paragraphs for the last several classes. You might have noticed that the textbook has given you many samples of paragraphs, standalone paragraphs. And to remind you, a paragraph basically deals with one subject or one topic. It's got a topic sentence, which is usually that first sentence that summarizes what the paragraph is about. It's got supporting sentences. This is where we have our three pieces of evidence with details to support the position that we're taking. And then finally, it's got a concluding sentence. This is where we've got a sentence that gives a sense of closure. So in terms of writing paragraphs, what I wanted to do was to have you, for your first paper, write a paragraph. Now, certainly you can write more than one paragraph, and this is what we are going to do with our second paper. We're going to talk about how usually we have an introductory paragraph, a body paragraph, and a concluding paragraph. And the text had already talked about that as well. But I wanted us to at least be able to write one well-written paragraph, a paragraph that has enough depth that it could stand on its own as a response. So if we were going to write a paragraph with a topic sentence, and then it's got three supporting sentences, and then each of those three supporting sentences have several sentences of details, and then we have a concluding sentence, obviously we've got a rather well-developed paragraph that's multiple sentences long, 8, 10, maybe even 15 sentences long. And if we were to double space that the way we are required or expected to do when we're writing with 1-inch margins, that would probably be about a page of typing. Now, not all of your paragraphs will obviously be that long, but you can think about that in terms of what the expectations are for that first writing assignment, about a page-long paragraph, in which you discuss, and I thought this might be a good question to think about over the course of the semester, to discuss an activity that gives you a feeling of accomplishment and why. Now, there are lots of activities that we can engage in that make us feel accomplished. It can be on some days, something as small as just being able to make it through that particular day or getting out of bed. Or it could be something huge like earning a degree, or it could be something in between. But the idea is that to think about things that make you feel accomplished and why they make you feel accomplished. And my hope, much like the Wellness Journal, is that you'll be able to take this information and transfer it over to other areas in your life. So your first paper, so to speak, is going to be to write at least a 1-paragraph essay in which you discuss an activity that gives you a feeling of accomplishment and why it gives you a feeling of accomplishment. Remember, you want to provide details and specifics in your essay. The syllabus talks about the formatting specifications that I've just reviewed as well, about typing and double-space 1-inch margins. So you've got some time to work on this as we continue to talk about what a paragraph is and what a well-developed paragraph will look like. I'll give you some examples next class. Keep in mind that next week on Monday, we do not have class because that is Indigenous Peoples Day, so there's no class. So basically, we are meeting again on Wednesday, the 13th. And this is where we are going to be talking about some more grammar, subjects and verbs, 4 bases for revising essays. We'll talk about fragments, so there's more grammar there as well. And we'll also talk a little bit more about that first formal writing assignment, which isn't going to be due for a little bit of time because I wanted us to have time in class to talk about journals first. But eventually we will transition over to having that be an assignment that we will be handing in class. So today's attendance question to help prepare you for thinking about ways that you could possibly go through answering this question. I thought that what you could all do is to try to indicate one activity that gives you a feeling of accomplishment. That's not to say that's what you have to write your essay about, but I wanted you to do some brainstorming at this point about an activity. So when you read your classmates' responses, what you should see are quite a few activities that can be associated with the idea of accomplishment. Though I had given you some suggestions as well, but I would be more interested to hear your real life ideas about accomplishment and things that make you feel accomplished. Again, because my hope is that that's something that we can transfer over as the semester progresses. So we will continue on next class talking about paper number 1. That's going to be due on the 18th of October, which is a Monday. So we've got a little bit of time here to be able to work on it. And again, we're not meeting on the 11th, and I'll post something on Moodle to remind you of that. We're meeting on the 13th, so we can talk more about that paper number 1. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And again, the attendance form question will be due on Thursday, the 7th of October at 10 a.m. an activity that gives you a feeling of accomplishment, and you don't even necessarily have to put it in a complete sentence if you didn't necessarily want to, but basically you are talking about an activity that gives you a feeling of accomplishment. And then we will pick up from there. And I hope you're well. I'm well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.